AI is very secondary to this idea of it's this something that helped us fuel an excitement around curiosity. And curiosity is already existing in students. So constantly as educators, how might we consider how to allow opportunities for student curiosity to emerge and show up and continue to flourish in classrooms? And so AI might be one of those tools of like, just because there's such an immediacy to that of like, you're curious, ask a question, what did it say? That kind of thing, right?
This is High Tech High Unboxed. I'm Alec Patton, and that was the voice of John Santos. John teaches 12th grade environmental science at High Tech High, and I sat down with him in his classroom to talk about how he and his students are experimenting with AI. And if you've ever met John Santos, all I can say is, I'm as surprised as you.
John Santos talking about artificial intelligence. I don't want to say that you're the last teacher in the world I expected to be having this conversation with, but you're reasonably close.
As soon as you said John Santos talking about artificial intelligence, I thought like, oh man, why am I on this side of the mic? They came to me to talk about this.
If we were talking about like new technology you're excited about, I would assume it involved like a table saw, maybe some sort of new form of neoprene that was like really upgrading wetsuit technology. Like I know you know how to use a computer, but I don't think of it as being an experience you enjoy or seek out.
Yeah. It's, I mean, that in itself makes it really exciting. This whole thing of I often have this like, hey, you guys gather around. I'm going to show you this thing I found in Google Docs. And they're like, that was like 5 years ago, man. But it's like,
By they, you mean like 11th graders.
My students, my colleagues, my children, my wife. Yeah. But yeah, I see technology. It's such a powerful tool. And so for me, I feel like because I'm behind the learning curve, I'm always learning. Maybe you guys that are right at the cusp of this whole thing, maybe you feel a little bit more impatient. But yeah, for me, there's all sorts of learning that lies ahead.
What made you start exploring AI?
So AI specifically, it's interesting that happens, this instinct in teachers. When something comes up that is new, there's kind of this instinct of like, okay, this seems like there might be something in this for my students to experience, something that's authentic. This is really happening out there in the real world. And so this inclination of like, I want to bring this in to our learning environment. And then this is where the instinct gets tricky, is like, well, before I bring this in, I need to go become some level of expert on this thing before I can even bring it in. Because in absence of that, there's this potential for bottlenecks, these unforeseen outcomes, it might fall flat. And so for me, this AI thing became, it's a new part of the conversation. And you're kind of hearing it pop up in all sorts of places. You hear it, come up with as an issue with Amazon, with these self-publishing authors that are just cranking out like several books per day. You're hearing this kind of worry around like, I'm afraid students are going to use this to create their essays for college. And so there was a buzz around it, and I was just interested in the buzz. And for what I was probably most interested in is what does it look like for a teacher to jump in and learn about something alongside their students? And so AI actually just happened to be what was happening right then that I was unfamiliar with, but it seemed like there was some value or at least interest or application. And so it was like, I wonder how we might wrap our learning around this and kind of dive into it together. That's what I loved about jumping into AI with students, is that it was like immediately very messy and all sorts of unforeseen things that I wouldn't have actually brought up. I would have probably, if it was left to me, I would have chosen one platform, and I would have said, okay, it's going to be ChatGPT or Bard. But students started bringing up this idea of like, did you know that Snapchat has its own AI? I was like, I had no idea. And did you know? And so they brought in all these other platforms, and then it started to become these questions of like, what would it look like to ask Snapchat AI and Bard or ChatGPT the same exact set of questions? What would those responses look like? And it was like, oh, that conversation, it yielded more than ultimately just the questions and responses we were even getting from AI. Was more the conversation around like, how will we use AI? And then also I think what it felt like as a community, that wasn't a one person thinking that. We were collectively kind of like trying to figure something out together. It felt good.
To understand how John and his students actually ended up using AI, first you need to know about the project they're working on this semester.
The whole goal of the project is to understand how feeding our community impacts our own health wellness, but then also the wellness of the environment. And the question we're asking specific to biology is, what does it look like to be proactive about our health and wellness? I think so much of our understanding of health and wellness is actually really our approach to curing illness. So as a society, we predominantly function on this thing that if you're well, just keep doing whatever it is that you're doing. And then if something comes up and you fall ill, that's kind of like how we wrap ourselves. That's kind of the construct around wellness is really treating illness. And so we're asking ourselves that question: what does it look like to be proactive about wellness? And so our students are looking at their own, backgrounds, their values, their identity. They're looking at things very specifically and myopically around kind of like food and nutrition. But then they're also kind of asking themselves questions about like, what are their behaviors? What are things that they might try that might impact their health and wellness? And the whole goal in the end is that they have kind of a sense of what it looks like for themselves to act in ways that contribute to their health and well-being and that align with their values.
How did you launch that?
The way we launched it is we ate a bunch of food, and I put out just this spectrum of snacks from candy to celery kind of thing. Students ate food, and they started considering what happens with digestion and what happens, what's involved and what's going on in that process. And then we started coming up with questions around diet, nutrition, but then also as it applied to our own identity and our background and our values. And we sort of threw a bunch of questions up there. And then I felt like once we had like at least this initial kind of representation of our curiosity and our wondering, then we thought like, okay, where do we go from here? And I think, traditionally you go to an expert. And that might be a teacher at the very base level. It might be some person who's like a nutritionist or something like that. But it's like there's this new thing now. It's like, is AI an expert? And I think that's kind of part of what we were looking at is like, can we trust AI as an expert? And then ultimately the other thing is like, can we get our questions answered and, get information as well?
So you kind of started, like, if you will, with a very classic inquiry-led project of like, let's look at a thing, let's generate some questions from the group. Like lots of projects have started that way throughout the history of project-based learning.
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh, there's this new way to try to answer this. Let's field test it.
Yeah. I think that's a great description, this idea of just like jumping into it together, field testing it. And I think it wasn't on the front end. I don't think that there was this agreement that like this inquiry will be answered by artificial intelligence. It was like, let's see how this comes out. Mm-hmm. And I mean, for me as a teacher, I think there's such a greater value in teaching your students how to ask good questions and how to be curious and how to wonder and how to let that kind of drive the learning process. And so it's not that we had this one day where we came up with this set of questions and then we ran that up through AI and got some responses. It's really that like, okay, well then what comes next? And we've continued to use AI, not in any sort of like everybody uses it sort of way. It's like every once in a while with individual students, I'm like, what would this look like if we ran this through AI? Or like, what would this look like if we actually reached out and connected with somebody, a human in the community and asked them this set of questions? And so, the goal of the project is actually to continue to interview, and just for the opportunity to interact with people outside of this place, we have our students interviewing other experts as well. Mm-hmm. It's all part of that process.
So talking to experts is a big dimension of this project.
I think talking to experts is a big dimension of learning, or, just that kind of interaction. Yeah, I think so.
And so it seems like you had the idea that students should talk to people and talk to experts who are outside the classroom and expand their horizons. And they kind of started that process by talking to robots.
Yeah. Yes. And each other. Yeah. But yes. Yeah. Talking to robots.
So what insights did you all get from the robot stage of this project?
I mean, there were a lot. I think within it, there was something really lovely about it, this idea that, like, I don't know that students typically scrutinize responses they would get from a human expert. They would accept them as vetted, true information, versus this idea when there's something new, or even something that you're skeptical about. Remember Wikipedia? where it was just like, hey, everybody, okay, I don't know, you guys should stay away from that. But it's this idea is that as it came through, I think that they were that much more, in a really great way, they kind of scrutinized the responses and considered kind of the value of what it was that they got back. I think that there was that. I think that we were really surprised, or at least, students were really vocal about this idea of like, you should take a look at this response that I got here. It is incredibly thorough and informative, and it gave me back all sorts of stuff that is even kind of in addition to the question that I asked that I wasn't really expecting. Or you had the other end of the spectrum, which was really great to hear from students of like, this is the most bland, non-informative response that I could have. Typically, which came from Snapchat's AI, just so everybody knows.
Don't sue Snapchat. And my understanding is one of the things that you started using it for was actual preparation for interviewing humans.
Yes. And that's what was so interesting about this, is I thought of it as well, let's just see what happens here. But again, it was a genuine exploration. And I would have thought that it would basically be kind of a dressed up Wikipedia of like, we're going to get online, we're going to ask some questions, we're going to find some information, and it's going to be very transactional. And in the end, it felt like there was a kind of a greater value than I thought there was going to be. And I think it's like students learned how to use it as a tool. I think there was also really healthy conversation about like where you wouldn't use this kind of thing and where it just didn't feel applicable or like it was going to be, a contributing tool.
Where was that?
I think it starts to run into a challenge when it comes to things like around preferences and kind of the emotion behind things. It's really hard to get AI to kind of respond in emotional ways or, so a lot of this was around values. And it's this idea of like, you can get the internet to tell you all sorts of information with regard to like, what is the healthiest snack you should eat to start your morning right? But if the internet doesn't know who you are and what your values are and what types of, culture you want to bring into your own eating processes, it can't really kind of give you responses that then have any sort of value to you. And so that's where I saw that there was a little bit of lag time in terms of adjusting to that, is like how my AI does much better than something like Google or just the basic internet does, to where in terms of adjusting to a person's identity and saying like, hey, this is a really important value to me heading into this question. So can you use this as a filter as you start to look for responses? It was still limited, but still pretty impressive.
And so, so at some point you started running practice interviews. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Well, I'd say, yeah, it's at some point what we started doing is creating interviews and curating interviews with each other and critiquing interviews with each other.
And you were using AI for that in some way, weren't you?
Oh, right. Yeah. During the first initial rounds. Well, I always think too of like creating an interview as it's like the interview itself is this thing. And then that can be run through something like AI. It can be run through a person. It can be run through a peer and things like that. So yeah, we created interviews, and then
When you say created interviews, you mean like a set of questions?
Our students created sets of questions that intended to be used in interviews.
Right.
Yeah.
And you field tested them on each other as you would have 10 years ago of like, hey, I'm going to do this interview. You pair off with this person and do a role play. Like that, I'm familiar with that process.
Right.
But then it was like, why don't you do this interview with ChatGPT or do this interview with Snapchat's not very good AI, or that's the...
Yeah, well, it was take this set of questions and then go experiment with AI. And so there were different students that experimented in different ways. I would say, by and large, what students used it for is they created a set of questions and they ran those through one AI platform. But then there were other students that were actually more interested to see if they ran that same interview through different types of platforms, what types of responses they got. So they had this kind of secondary curiosity of like, yeah, I want to see what it says about my diet and nutritional choices that I'm making. But I'm also really interested to see what types of differences kind of emerge. And so that kind of drove their curiosity as well.
And have the students started using those questions to interview human experts?
They haven't yet. Well, so actually we're creating an entirely new set of questions, because now it's, that was the first one where students were really looking at very specifically at diet and nutritional choices. Now I think we're kind of broadening that question to what does it look like to be proactive about wellness? And so that might be being proactive about, seeking therapy. That might be being proactive about stretching. So it's kind of, we've broadened that. And so the hope is that you generate a whole new set of questions and then run that through experts, human experts. I wonder what it would look like to run those same questions, though, that they ran through AI and connect with experts that might respond to them. That might be kind of cool.
Awesome. So okay, one question. Was there a point in this process where you thought, I wish I'd actually done a little bit more background before I brought the students in on this?
No. I would say it was exactly the opposite. I felt very, very celebratory of this idea of like, I'm so glad that we really dove into this at the same exact time alongside each other. That being said, there was also a degree or an element of luck that I felt too, of like, I'm glad that my students have learned to, so for instance, a couple things came up of like, very first thing, they flipped open their school computers and just said, oh yeah, all AI is blocked on school computers. And so then one student said, yeah, but you can circumnavigate that if you log into your own email address, your personal email address, and you could do it that way. Or another said like, you can actually access it by way of your phone and do it this way. And so I get that there could have been a couple huge roadblocks that came up that just shut the entire thing down that we would have to kind of, I guess, pivot and figure out. So there's a degree of luck in that, but it worked out. And for me, the excitement around like, we're really in this together, and the idea that I don't know that I would have been able to figure out how to circumnavigate that, of this idea of like, well, I'll try my personal email. It's like students are really good at that stuff. So no, I'm really glad we explored that together. And it felt good. It felt like real learning.
Is this podcast going to be how IT finds out that you skirted their protections in order to have your students go directly onto AI from school computers?
IT and I are always on the up and up. And so I see that they're total colleagues in this, and I went to them, and they're kind of, that's what's interesting is IT right now, I think it's across the board, organizationally, it's this big question mark with like, what do we do with this? Do we block it completely and just keep it away from the conversation at all? Do we do we figure out one that we use? Do we completely open things up? I mean, you and I both, it's like, 1 year max before it's like, of course, AI is going to make its way into school. And it's like, how might we use that? So for now, it's blocked. IT's been super cool about it. They themselves are asking the question of like, to what degree and how might we open this and make it available as a very useful tool to students?
Awesome. So I'm going to say 3, but you can make it whatever you want.
Okay.
From where you're at now, and you're still kind of in the middle, no claims that you're like an expert. You're like
Yeah.
2 months more of an expert than somebody who's totally new to this. But what are your pro tips for a teacher who's thinking like, yeah, seems like I could be using AI with students?
What are my pro tips? Oh, man.
Professional AI user.
Yeah. John
Santos.
professional AI user John Santos. His pro tips are, I don't know. I think of it as like AI is very secondary to this idea of it's this something that helped us fuel an excitement around curiosity. And curiosity is already existing in students. So constantly as educators, how might we consider how to allow opportunities for student curiosity to emerge and show up and continue to flourish in classrooms? And so AI might be one of those tools of like, just because there's such an immediacy to that of like, you're curious, ask a question, what did it say? That kind of thing, right? And so it's like, how might we use it as a tool to, foster or support curiosity in the space? Use your students, definitely, and open up the conversation because they're probably already using it in some ways. I would say don't constrain the exploration and don't say like, Snapchat, absolutely not. That to me was probably one of the more valuable things we got out of that. So I think I have 2, not 3. Can you think of any pro tips?
No. Two's good.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much, John Santos, for joining us. The listeners should know that you've been dressed as a professional lobster fisherman for this entire interview, it being October 31st.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
High Tech High Unboxed is hosted and edited by me, Alec Patton. Our theme music is by Brother Herschel. In our show notes, we've got an article by the middle school teacher Sean Gilly explaining how he used AI to help him plan a project for his students. Thanks for listening.